Pandemics are those diseases which have presence in more than one area. Now, if we look on to the history, Americas was not discovered, so the only parcel of land that was discovered is here on the globe. Now, if a disease has a presence in more than one location across different continents, we would say it is pandemic. So, what we are trying to understand today is what was the spatial location that was responsible for the development of certain diseases and why certain diseases had a specific path, and we could see a overlap in most of the patterns of the diseases that were registered. We'll understand this in a while in detail. Now, the first civilizations that were tracked was the Mesopotamian civilization, which originated on the banks of Euphrates and Tigris river, now crossing the present day Iraq region. Now, it was here that the first proximity between animals and human beings were seen. You might wonder how, but with a settled life and a settled agriculture, what happened was animal rearing started and animals came in close proximity with human beings. As a result, most of the diseases which were transmitted from animals started to affect human beings, and the concept of zoonotic diseases originating from animal life basically started. So that was how we begin with the spread of diseases. Now, this spread of disease was definitely limited to specific parcels where the civilizations existed, but later on what happened was there was over the centuries we saw that there was a spread of various diseases. So the line that we have marked in red shows the pattern of the spread of the first of its kind of disease, which was known as the plague of Athens. Now, this plague of Athens started back in 430 BC, and it started from the regions close to Djibouti in Egypt. Slowly and gradually, with the people moving from Egyptian civilization to the coastal areas of Mediterranean, this disease started to be onto the coast of Mediterranean. And finally, when you had the further movement of the people from the Mediterranean coastline to the various islands, it slowly and gradually moved to Malta and then to the region of Greece. Within the region of Greece, you had two major regions, which was the Sparta and the Athens. So Athens became one of the epicenters, and therefore it is known as the plague of Athens. So in the present day Greece, you have Athens and Sparta, and there was a constant conflict between the two kingdoms at that time. And finally, in the region of Sycharis, you have the spread of the disease that was registered. Of that time, it is believed that you had nearly a loss of 25 to 30% of the population of that time that was registered. Now, moving on to the next plague is the plague of Antonine. Now, the plague of Antonine basically affected the city of Rome. So, in the regions of Italy, we could see that this was the region where you had the worst impacts of the Antonine plague that was registered, and this was in 165 AD. And during this time, you had the people coming from mainly the Mesopotamian region that started to bring the disease. And the purple marks that you could see was the slow and gradual expansion of the plague or the a pandemic that was registered. Now, what was the cause of the pandemic? The cause of the pandemic is still not known. It is believed that it had been either smallpox or measles or something like that which affected this region. But as you could see, a huge proportion of the region surrounding the Mediterranean region was affected, and most of the South Europe was affected. And that's why it's commonly said that South Europe was relatively unstable It's believed that it was because of the proximity to the Mediterranean Sea and the African subcontinent. But another reason for the instability in South Europe was a series of pandemics that affected that area. So this was the purple marks, as you can see, are the areas which were affected by the Antonine plague. City of Rome was in Italy was the worst affected. So basically Italy was one of the worst affected areas, and slowly and gradually it is spread to the regions of France, Spain, the regions of Greece, and parts of Turkey that was seen. During that time, it killed nearly 5 million population, and this plague was also known as the plague of Galen. Now, understand that the plague is a common term that is used. It's not related to only the plague that is being spread by rats. So this Antonine plague has been believed to be either due to smallpox or measles as one of the reasons that was seen. The next important plague was the plague of Justinian. Now, the plague of Justinian was basically the green markings that you can see here. So, this whole green area was the area which was believed to be the area which was affected during the plague of Justinian. Now, definitely it was one of the diseases that originated from Central Asia. So travelers coming from Central Asia brought this disease. Now this disease was brought through two routes. As we can understand, you have the two routes that are here. So this green lines that you can see, one was through the land route and the other green line goes through the sea route and enters in here through the Port Said. Now finally, from this region, closer to the region of Egypt and Turkey, it is spread to the parts of Europe and the coastal areas. It affected the whole of the Byzantine Empire during that time. Constantinople was one of the worst affected places. Now, the most important thing, the first known bubonic plague was the plague of Justinian. Plague of Justinian affected 30 to 100 million population and it remained there for more than 2 centuries. So for more than 2 centuries, that is for a period of nearly 200 years, there were constant off and on spurts of the plague that were registered in this area, and plague of Justinian was the first registered case. I repeat again, it was the first registered case of the bubonic plague which is spread from rats, and these rats used to come in the vessels in the shipments coming from Central Asia. So through the Silk Route, through the land Silk Route and the marine Silk Route, what was happening, the trade was taking place in the regions of Europe, and in the parcels or in the ships that were coming in, you had rats that were moving in, and these rats slowly and gradually spread into the nearby territories and affected the region. After the plague of Justinian, there was, I could say, a gap of few years until when you had the second bubonic major plague that was seen. But during this time, there was another major disease that struck most of the regions, and this was leprosy. Now, leprosy was one of the diseases which spread mainly from the regions again in the Mediterranean region, mainly the regions of Italy, and you had sick homes or shelter homes or the quarantine centers which were established for leprosy patients. Now, these patients were kept in isolation. There was a kind of stigma associated to the people suffering from leprosy. So, leprosy became one of the major curse, we would say, during that period. So the next that we would understand is the pattern. So we already saw how the plague of Justinian is spread from the regions of Central Asia. The next important plague that we would understand is the Black Death. Now, what was actually the Black Death? Black Death was one of the concepts that affected or started from the regions of China and affected most of the provinces across the land continent, as you could see. So it started from the regions of Central Asia and China, and all the markings that you could see in the regions of black. Okay, so the marking of black black color, as you could see, is the region which was affected by Black Death, and therefore we have marked it as black. But this was technically the second worst bubonic plague that affected the continents, and it was there in 1347 till 1351. Kaffa on the coast of Black Sea was one of the worst affected areas. Now, as you could see, this was the region where you had Black Death that started, the bubonic plague that started in the regions of Central Asia, but slowly and gradually it started to move far off till the regions of Europe. So this black line, we could say, slowly and gradually started to move and affect most of the regions of Europe, except a little region in the center, which was mainly the regions of Poland, Hungary, Bohemia region, and that was the region which was unaffected for some reasons, still to track under the Black Death. So the area which was affected by Black Death included the present day Europe as well. It is believed that half of the population of Europe wiped off. It killed nearly 50% of the people of Europe during that time, and it was not seen once. There were recurrent episodes of bubonic deaths that were seen. And finally, the most interesting thing was the ships entering through the ports. Now, it was well established by the 14th century that the rats were coming from the ships, and these rats were spreading the disease. So what was by principle a rule made was in the city of Venice, where a mandatory quarantine for all the ships arriving to the port of Italy in Venice was registered, and this quarantine period was 40 days. So for 40 days none of the ships was allowed to land onto the coast, and this was during this time that the word quaranta in Roman language started to came into existence, and since then we have the term quarantine that started. So you have a mandatory hold of the ships onto the coastal areas for a minimum of 40 days before landing onto the coast. That was a preventive action taken during that time in the regions of Italy. So as you could see, this whole region that we have seen in the black was the worst affected territories of Black Death, and it was a severe pandemic because whole of the Central Asia, parts of China, and then you have the parts of the Middle East, and finally Europe that were affected, and Kaffa on the Black Sea was one of the worst affected regions. The next that we need to understand is, after the Black Death there was series of discoveries that took place. Now these discoveries were by Columbus, by Vasco da Gama, and you had whole lot of movement that was seen. So these movements were seen mainly from the port areas of Spain, Portugal, parts of France, and then you had Britain. And what happened was the new world was discovered, which was Americas, which was not so popular before. Now, as the new world was discovered, there was interchange of diseases that started. So what kind of diseases interchanged? So the first disease that is spread from the port areas of Europe to the regions of Americas was a smallpox. So Europeans took along with them smallpox to Americas. In return, Americas gifted Europeans the disease of syphilis. So there was a kind of interchange of the diseases that started to take place as the new world was discovered, and you had new continents that came into existence. Later on, it was also believed that you had numerous diseases that were a kind of regional diseases, or I could say endemic diseases. For example, in the regions of Africa, you had diseases like yellow fever, you had diseases like malaria that was spread, and these were the pockets that were seen initially in the regions of Africa, but slowly and gradually these pockets developed and you had mosquitoes that were moving from the coastal areas in the ships again. So next to rats, what moved was mosquitoes, and initially it was the bubonic plague that started, and later on it was malaria that started. So yellow fever, malaria were some of the diseases that started to spread across continents, going through the ships, and from the ships these mosquitoes were traveling to far off areas. Now, the next important outbreak that was registered was the outbreak that we understand was for cholera, and this was the region. Which region? You had the region of Indian subcontinent, the region of Bengal province during that time, which was worst affected by cholera. Now, cholera is a diarrheal disease due to improper sanitation and lack of pure drinking water, or clean drinking water, we could say. And hygiene is what matters. So you have cholera that started from the regions of West Bengal, and slowly and gradually from the regions of West Bengal, all that which is marked in yellow was the area that was affected by the cholera during that time. Now, this cholera outbreak was significant. It started in 1870s 17s, and this was during when you had the East India Company ruling onto India, and poor hygiene, malnutrition, poverty were some of the associated features. Now, even if we trace back to the bubonic plague, poverty, malnourishment was some of the reasons that caused maximum deaths in the regions of Europe. So over the centuries, what we have seen that unhealthy living conditions, malnutrition are some of the major reasons for significant human loss in most of the pandemics that have been registered. So this was the time where you had the cholera pandemic, again with one of the same primary reasons as we have traced. And next to the cholera pandemic that you could see was a series of influenzas that affected. So during the during the First World War, you had we do not have the still known reason how it originated, but during the First World War, you had disease that started, the influenza that started towards the end of the First World War, and this was the Spanish flu. Now, Spanish flu, when it went to United States, across the continents, the condition worsened because it is believed that it mutated. Now, as soon as it mutated and it came back to the areas of Europe, you had significant casualties that were registered during the period of Spanish flu, and it is believed that it remained there for more than 2 to 3 years before it was totally wiped off. Now, next to the Spanish flu, you had numerous other flus that were registered. You had another important flu before the Spanish flu, which was the Russian flu that was seen in the regions of the USSR that we saw. And then you had the Spanish flu during the period of the closure of the First World War that was registered. After that, in 1947, when India got independent, you had the Asian flu that started. And in 1958, I believe, in 1947 or 57, during that period, you had the Asian flu. And during the period of 1958, you had the Hong Kong flu that started. So various kind of flus started to affect the regions, and since then it has become a kind of more than unexpectedly common pandemic that has been registered. So the next important development was seen in the regions of Yunnan. Now, this Yunnan province of China, as you can see in the labeling here, was one of the regions where you had the third bubonic plague that started. So after the second bubonic plague, which was the Black Death, you had the origin of the third bubonic plague that started from the regions of Yunnan, going to the coastal areas of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and affecting parts of the South China Sea. And from that region, through the ships, it was traveling to most of the Mediterranean region, back to the regions of Europe. So this was the region of Yunnan where you had the third bubonic plague that started. And finally, after that, we have the next important marker in the history, and that is the COVID 19 originating from the regions of Wuhan in China, and presently there more than 6 million population already affected and still many more to go. So it's very important to be very cautious at this point of time and understand how these pandemics have behaved, what were the geographical areas that were worst affected, and as we have traced over the history, there were certain areas which were frequently affected. So jotting those down over the time has been very very important to understand any future pattern of the growth of pandemics. So that was something about a kind of introductory session about how the pandemics have evolved, what was the regional pattern, and how rats and mosquitoes have been spreading to different parts of the globe through the ships and through the transport that is occurring. So definitely globalization is one of the binding factors, but we could say one of the breaking factors when it comes to pandemics as such. So that was what we have covered here. We would be covering many more interesting lectures. Stay tuned. Have a wonderful day ahead.